Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be looking at the really interesting topic of mercy and forgiveness. And, you might not expect this, but we're going to start with a specific date, Monday, March 17th, 2025. And we're going to be kind of examining this day through a bunch of different sources, from biblical readings and reflections on those readings to a really compelling biography of a historical figure who really embodies these themes.
It's really interesting how this date connects to the Catholic calendar. It falls during Lent, which is a time for reflection and repentance before Easter.
So, like a spiritual New Year's resolution,
Yeah,
but with less champagne and more introspection.
exactly. And to add another layer, March 17th is also the optional remembrance of three figures: St. Patrick, a bishop; Joseph of Arimathea, a disciple of Jesus; and then St. Gertrude of Nivelles, who was a confessor.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got this idea of Lent, a time of repentance, and the remembrance of these figures. It feels like we're being set up for some serious soul searching. But let's get into the specifics. One of our sources highlights a reading from the book of Daniel, chapter 9.
Yeah, and this reading is really powerful because it features Daniel, who is a prophet living in exile, and he's expressing deep sorrow over the sins of his people, which ultimately led to their captivity. And he says, and this is a quote, "We have sinned and done wrong, acted wickedly and rebelled, turning aside from your commands and decrees."
Wow, that's a pretty stark admission of guilt. There's no shying away from responsibility there. It reminds me of something I've always kind of wondered about, like why is confession considered such a vital step in seeking forgiveness, both in a religious context and even in our personal lives?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's about acknowledging the harm we've caused, both to ourselves and to others. It's about taking ownership for what we've done and expressing sincere remorse. And, that act of confession, of actually saying the wrong that we did, can be incredibly cathartic for both the person who's confessing and also for the people who have been hurt. It's a starting point for healing and reconciliation.
Yeah, it's like that feeling of relief you get when you finally admit to something you've been hiding. It's like a weight's been lifted off your shoulders. But confession alone isn't enough, right? There's got to be more to it than that.
You're exactly right.
Like, how do we make sure that our confession isn't just empty words? How do we make sure it really reflects a true desire to change?
You're hitting on a really crucial point, I think. True repentance goes beyond just saying, "I'm sorry." It really involves a genuine desire to make amends, to actually change our behavior, and to live in a way that actually aligns with our values. It's about acknowledging the impact of our actions and actually trying to do better.
So it's not just about words, but about actions that demonstrate our commitment to change.
Absolutely. And, this theme of acknowledging our mistakes and seeking forgiveness, this echoes throughout another one of our sources, Psalm 79. The psalmist reflects on past errors and pleads for God's mercy, and they say, "Do not remember against us former iniquities. May your compassion come speedily to meet us, for we are in desperate need."
It's interesting how both Daniel and the psalmist really emphasize this need for mercy and compassion. It's like they're acknowledging that they messed up, but they're still holding on to this hope for a second chance. I think that's a pretty universal feeling, regardless of your religious beliefs. We all make mistakes, and I think wanting a fresh start is just part of being human.
Absolutely. We all have those moments where we wish we could just take something back, or choices we regret. And in those moments, we crave understanding. We hope that we're not going to be defined by the mistakes that we've made.
It makes me think about how we often extend that same hope to others. We want to believe that people are capable of changing and learning from their mistakes, that they can become better versions of themselves. But I don't know, where do we draw the line? How do we balance that hope for redemption with the need for accountability and justice?
That is such a complex question, and it's one that societies have really struggled with for centuries, you know? I think it's about recognizing that forgiveness doesn't get rid of the need for consequences. It's about holding people responsible for what they've done while also acknowledging that they can grow and change for the better.
So it's not about condoning harmful actions, but about creating a space for genuine change and rehabilitation.
Precisely. Now, speaking of forgiveness and the path to redemption, our next source takes us to a pretty pivotal moment in Christian teachings, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 6.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. I've always been fascinated by this passage. What makes Jesus's teachings on forgiveness so unique and, I don't know, so radical?
I think it's the emphasis on action, on actually living out these principles in our daily lives.
Yeah.
Jesus doesn't just offer these vague sayings about being nice to each other. He really lays out these clear instructions for how to live a life based on forgiveness.
So give us some examples. Like, what are some of those specific instructions that stand out to you?
Well, he starts by saying, be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. And it's not really a suggestion, it's like a command. We're supposed to imitate God's infinite mercy in how we treat other people.
Yeah, it's like we're being challenged to go beyond our limited human perspective and try to access this deeper well of compassion and understanding.
Right. And then he goes on to say, do not judge, and you will not be judged. This part, it always gets me thinking, how often do we make assumptions about other people without even knowing the whole story? It's a reminder to try to be empathetic and to withhold judgment.
It's a tough one, that's for sure, especially in today's world where it's so easy to form opinions based on just little bits of information or social media posts. It's like we're constantly being given chances to judge and to categorize and to separate ourselves from others.
Hmm.
But Jesus doesn't stop there, does he? What does he say next?
This is where it gets even more challenging. He says, forgive, and you will be forgiven. And I think this beautifully connects back to Daniel's plea in Psalm 79. Forgiveness, it's a cyclical process. It begins with understanding our own need to be forgiven and then giving that same grace to others. It's not about forgetting what happened or saying it was okay, but about letting go of the anger and resentment that we're holding on to.
Right. It's about breaking free from those cycles of negativity and creating a space for healing and reconciliation, both within ourselves and in our relationships with other people. It's one thing to talk about forgiveness in theory, but it's something else entirely to actually put it into practice,
Hmm.
especially when we've been deeply hurt or wronged. Are there any practical tips or strategies for actually being able to forgive people in those situations?
I think that's where the story of St. Patrick comes in. His life really embodies these teachings in such an amazing way. Because, he wasn't always a saint. Actually, his journey began with a lot of pain and suffering. He was kidnapped when he was a teenager from his home in Roman Britain, and he was sold into slavery in Ireland. Can you imagine the bitterness and resentment he must have felt towards the people who did this to him?
It's hard to even fathom going through something like that. It's no wonder that he was carrying around those intense feelings. But what happened next? How did he go from being a victim of such horrible treatment to becoming the symbol of forgiveness and reconciliation?
That's what makes his story so powerful. Despite that awful experience, Patrick found his way back to faith. He did eventually escape from slavery, but instead of trying to get revenge, he felt this calling to return to Ireland, the very place where all that suffering had happened.
That's incredible. To willingly go back to a place that must have held so much pain and trauma for him. That takes a remarkable amount of courage and compassion. What motivated him to make that choice?
Well, he dedicated his life to converting the Irish people to Christianity,
Mm.
the same people who had enslaved him. His life became this testament to the idea that forgiveness can completely transform a person. It's not like he pretended that the past didn't happen. He acknowledged his pain, but he chose to overcome it and turn that suffering into something positive and life-affirming.
Wow. That's a truly powerful act of forgiveness. It makes me think about how we all have that potential to break free from those cycles of hurt and anger. If St. Patrick could forgive his captors and then dedicate his life to their well-being, what seemingly impossible acts of forgiveness might be possible in our own lives?
That is a profound question to consider. It really challenges us to think about our own capacity to forgive, to explore how deep our compassion can go, and to see the potential for change that we all have within us.
This has been an incredible start to our deep dive. We've explored forgiveness from so many different angles: personal confession, biblical teachings, and the inspiring life of a saint. It's clear that forgiveness is more than just a nice idea. It's a powerful force for healing and transformation, both on a personal level and for society as a whole.
And we've only just begun to scratch the surface. There's so much more to discover as we look deeper into the lives of Joseph of Arimathea and St. Gertrude of Nivelles. Their stories offer unique perspectives on all the different aspects of forgiveness and its role in shaping history. Stick with us as we continue our exploration in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, so we're back and we're going to continue our deep dive into forgiveness. We've talked about how important confession is and the power of mercy, and we looked at the amazing example that St. Patrick set. But remember, he's not the only person who we remember on March 17th. There's also Joseph of Arimathea and St. Gertrude of Nivelles.
Right, and their stories offer some really interesting perspectives on how forgiveness can have so many sides to it.
Okay, cool. So let's start with Joseph of Arimathea. Our sources describe him as one of Jesus's disciples, but not one of the 12 apostles that we always hear about.
Exactly, yeah. He was actually part of the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish council that sentenced Jesus to death. But the interesting thing about Joseph is that he didn't agree with that decision. He's described as a secret disciple, someone who believed in Jesus, but was too afraid to say so openly because of what might happen.
So he was in a tough spot, huh? Like torn between his faith and his fear of what other people would think or do. That must have been really difficult to deal with.
Definitely. But get this, when Jesus was crucified, Joseph actually went to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, and asked if he could take Jesus' body to bury it.
That was a huge risk, right? I mean, taking the side of a condemned man, especially one who had been seen as like a threat to the Roman Empire, could have meant really bad things for him.
Oh, for sure, it could have. But Joseph's compassion and his sense of justice just wouldn't let him stand by and do nothing. He couldn't let them just disrespect Jesus' body like that. He had to make sure that he had a proper burial, even if it meant getting in trouble.
That's a really powerful act of standing up against injustice. It reminds me of all those people throughout history who maybe didn't lead huge revolutions or anything like that, but who quietly challenged how things were done.
Yeah.
Just by doing little things that actually made a big difference.
Exactly. And you could even say that Joseph giving Jesus a proper burial was its own act of forgiveness in a way. He wasn't saying that what they did to Jesus was okay, but he was choosing to act with love and respect, even though something so terrible had happened.
It's like he was stopping that cycle of violence and hatred, choosing a different way, a way of compassion and respect.
And think about this. What he did had some pretty big consequences. By giving Jesus a tomb, Joseph actually played a part in the whole story of Christianity without even meaning to. It was in that tomb that the resurrection is said to have taken place, and that event is like the foundation of the Christian faith.
Whoa. So this one small act of kindness and bravery ended up having a huge impact on the development of one of the world's biggest religions. It really shows how the choices we make, even small ones, can have ripple effects that we might not even realize.
It's a good reminder that we all have the power to make a difference, even in ways that seem insignificant at the time. What we do can have unexpected consequences that go far beyond ourselves.
So true. Speaking of people who made a difference, let's move on to St. Gertrude of Nivelles. Now, as we mentioned earlier, she's considered a confessor. Could you maybe explain what that means exactly for those of us who aren't familiar with the term?
Of course. In the Catholic Church, a confessor is someone who lived a really good and faithful life, often facing persecution or hardship for their beliefs. It doesn't necessarily mean that they were martyred for their faith, but they were definitely inspiring to others, and their lives showed how powerful faith can be.
So they're like role models, right? Showing us how to live a life that's true to our faith and values.
Exactly. And St. Gertrude is definitely a great example of that. She lived in 7th century Belgium, and she spent her life setting up monasteries and working to make sure women could get an education.
Now, that might not sound so revolutionary today, but back then it was a pretty big deal, right? I mean, women were mostly expected to just stay at home and take care of the house, and they weren't really given many chances to learn.
Absolutely. Gertrude was definitely going against the norms of her society. She created places where women could not only learn, but also grow in their faith and even become leaders in the church. It was a quiet kind of revolution, but powerful nonetheless.
It makes me think about how forgiveness works on different levels. We often think about forgiving other people, but Gertrude's story shows us that we can also forgive the systems and structures in society that are unfair and cause inequality.
That's a great point. Real forgiveness means that we have to face those ingrained patterns of oppression that are all around us and try to build a world where everyone is treated fairly.
So it's not just about being a good person ourselves, but also about taking responsibility for making society better as a whole. We all need to challenge those systems that hurt others and try to create a future where everyone has the chance to succeed and live up to their full potential.
And doing that takes a lot of courage and resilience, just like St. Gertrude showed us. She met a lot of resistance and pushback from people who didn't want things to change, but she didn't give up because she was so driven by her faith and her vision of a more inclusive society.
Her story is really inspiring. It reminds us that even when it seems like everyone's against us, we can still make a difference. We can choose to forgive those structures that have held us back, and we can work towards a world that's more just, compassionate, and forgiving. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into forgiveness. And wow, it's been quite a journey, hasn't it? We started by talking about forgiveness on a personal level, then connected it to making changes in society, and we even saw how it played out in the lives of some really amazing people like St. Patrick and St. Gertrude.
Yeah, definitely a lot to think about. And as we wrap things up, I think it's important to remember that forgiving someone isn't always easy. You know, it can be messy and complicated, with lots of ups and downs, and even some emotional turmoil along the way.
Oh, absolutely. It's not like forgiveness is some magic solution that makes the pain disappear or suddenly makes everything okay. It's more like this conscious choice that we have to make sometimes over and over again to let go of that anger and resentment that we're holding on to.
And making that choice can be incredibly hard, especially when we've been really hurt or treated badly. There are times when it feels like we just can't let go of the pain and anger. But even in those moments when you're really struggling, I think there's this tiny spark of hope, this realization that holding on to all those negative feelings is actually hurting us more than anyone else.
It's like that saying, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
Hmm.
We end up just poisoning ourselves with all those bad feelings, and it stops us from moving on and healing and growing.
Exactly. And that's where the stories of the three people we've been talking about, St. Patrick, Joseph of Arimathea, and St. Gertrude, can really help us. They all went through incredibly tough times, times when forgiving someone probably seemed impossible. But they chose a different way, a way of courage and compassion. And in the end, it changed them for the better.
Right. Their stories show us that forgiveness doesn't mean that we're just ignoring what happened or saying it was okay. It's about recognizing that we were hurt, acknowledging what those who hurt us did, and then making that choice to free ourselves from those heavy feelings.
And letting go, actually doing it, can feel so freeing. It helps us find peace within ourselves and allows us to see the world and other people with more understanding and empathy.
It's like we're breaking those chains that are keeping us tied to the past. And that opens up all sorts of new possibilities, a future where healing and making things right can actually happen.
And that healing process often reaches beyond just ourselves. Like we've been talking about, forgiveness has the power to change society too. When we choose to forgive those systems and structures that cause so much harm, we're making room for something new, something fair and more just.
It's like planting seeds of hope and nurturing this vision of a world where everyone has a chance to do well and live a good life, no matter what they've been through or what injustices they've faced.
And those seeds, even when planted in the most unexpected places, can grow into something amazing. Just think about Joseph of Arimathea. He could have easily kept quiet and gone along with everyone else, but he didn't. He stood up for what he believed in, even though it was dangerous. And that one act of compassion ended up changing the course of history.
It reminds us that we all have a part to play in making the world a more forgiving place. It starts with those little choices that we make every day, choosing to let go of anger, showing kindness to others, and trying to see things from their point of view.
And those little choices, all those acts of forgiveness, have a ripple effect. They touch our families, our communities, and eventually the whole world.
So I guess as we come to the end of our deep dive, the main thing to remember is that forgiveness is so much more than just being a good person or some religious idea. It's something powerful that can change people's lives, make things better, and lead us towards a brighter future.
It's definitely a journey that requires courage, compassion, and a willingness to really look at the complexities of what it means to be human. And even though it's not always easy, the rewards, both for ourselves and for everyone around us, are just incredible.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this exploration of forgiveness. We hope you've been inspired to think about the amazing things it can do and how it can help us build a world that's more just, more compassionate, and filled with more forgiveness. Until next time.
See you then.